Left off last time with the Articles of Confederation, their great success with a plan to settle the country. Everything else about them is a failure. Not surprisingly, we just had a revolution to overthrow a strong central government and a king, and the last thing we want to do is set up a strong central government again. However, in order to run a country, you have to have some efficient form of government. The revolution created the possibility of a new nation, but it is the Constitution that creates the government that makes it work. And as of present, the United States has the longest running single government in history, basically. Byzantine Empire was about 1,000 years, but lots of different phases in that. Okay, so why 10 years later, after taking all the state powers, do the states give their powers, a lot of their powers, to a new national government? And the answer is one word, largely chaos. Different monetary systems, different trading systems, different customs regulations. The war debt was a huge issue. Soldiers had been paid in paper money. The paper money was largely worthless at this time, and they're selling it for 10 cents on the dollar to rich people who can buy it up on the chance that it might get cashed in. Total chaos, basically. Taxes, actually, in order to run basically necessary infrastructure, after the war, surprisingly, taxes were raised 3 to 4 times as much as they were before the war. So a war over taxation without representation, the actual truth is the states had to raise taxes after the war. There's no federal government, for one thing, to pay for anything. The states are paying for everything along the way. The other problem they had is America financially is in chaos, and Europeans are not going to lend us money. Europeans are not going to invest, and there's not enough wealthy people in America with extra money to invest to get things done. I'm quoting Ben Franklin again. What men will lend money when the law does not enforce payment? We owed financially overseas. We had all kinds of debts coming out our ears, and the whole financial system is in chaos. So something needs to be done. What states did basically is print more money, which means that money becomes worth less and less. The trigger for this chaos keeps going on for a while, but the trigger for it all is in 1786 with not the guy you would imagine, slides 8 and 9, Daniel Shays. Daniel Shays is a poor farmer from western Massachusetts. He had been a lower level officer in the Revolution. What was happening in western Massachusetts and in many of the different former colonies is that people who couldn't pay their mortgages, does any of this sound familiar, were losing their farms, losing their businesses in foreclosures. So banks and wealthy individuals were buying up foreclosed property. You can't pay your debts, you lose your property, basically. Americans don't take to this too well. Surprisingly enough, about 10 years ago in 2008, we had over 1 million foreclosures and nobody did very much about it. But in the 1700s, people did. Armed groups would step in and stop foreclosures. If the sheriff came out to seize a property, all of a sudden all the farmers in the neighborhood would show up, and of course everybody in America has a gun, and the sheriff would decide maybe some other time I'll foreclose on this property. These were not mobs. These were largely Revolutionary War veterans. Shays himself had been a major. These are middle-class landowners. These are community leaders. Daniel Shays organizes a group of veterans. They seize a local armory, which is a stockpile of weapons, about 1,200 of them armed, march on Boston to end foreclosures. You can't foreclose on us because the paper money you paid us in the Revolution is worthless. Nobody will take it. They march on Boston, and they are citing, of course, the Declaration of Independence when they march. What happens? The people in Boston totally terrorized. Oh my God, there's a mob of 1,200 armed guys marching on Boston. Who knows what's going to happen? And the Massachusetts militia is called out by the new governor. The wealthy who own these mortgages, who own the banks, are really terrified by this. They call out the Massachusetts militia, and half of them join Daniel Shays' group because they're in the same place. The militia is in the same place. They're losing their properties and their farms too. The governor, in a panic, calls on the militia from other states who have no loyalty to local conditions, and actually there is some skirmishing, no real out-and-out battles. Shays' group kind of retreats. 150 are captured. A few are thrown in prison. Shays flees to Vermont, out of state. Vermont was a territory, not a complete state at that time, and Vermont refused to extradite him, refused to send him back for trial. The results of this: the next election in Massachusetts, 74% of the Massachusetts legislature are followers of Daniel Shays. What do we do in America if we don't like something? We don't overthrow the government, we vote our guys in office. Please remember that in the near future. These guys immediately pass favorable laws and no taxes, of course, and end the foreclosures. The other immediate result of this is that it makes very clear that the Articles of Confederation have no enforcement power. They have no taxing power, therefore they have no army, they have no arm of enforcement. They're not really worried about a bunch of farmers revolting. What we're really worried about, particularly in southern states, is the fear of slave revolts, which are already happening in the Caribbean. So this is a breakdown of order. It makes it very clear that we need some government that has some difference here. And a constitutional convention is called in Philadelphia in 1789 in the summer. They meet for 4 months. They work for 6 days a week, long days into the evening. If you've ever been in Philadelphia in the summer, it is incredibly hot and muggy. It's kind of like, not bad, but like Austin, actually, it can get in the summer. And this is a secret convention. 55 delegates come. About half of them had college degrees. 30 of them were Revolutionary War veterans. 17 were slaveholders. It is a closed-door convention. They don't want any records. They don't want anybody listening in. They have guards at the doors. They close the windows. They close the doors. I can't imagine how suffocatingly hot it was in Independence Hall when they did this. And the result is that we really don't know. When people say this is what the founders meant, this is what they meant in the Constitution, the actual truth is we have no records. There were no notes kept of the debates deliberately. They did not want to be on the record, particularly talking about slavery, but on other issues as well, because they'd probably be creamed for it later. There was one version of notes that was lost completely. Another one where people handwrote notes later on about what went on, the debates, that was translated into French and then back into English, so that's kind of iffy. Only James Madison, who really is a huge organizer and called the father of the Constitution, his notes, he's the guy who sat down every evening and wrote from memory what the debates were about. And James Madison is heavily biased in this convention. His notes were not published for decades, so there's a real question how accurate he was keeping notes. So when people talk about the founders meant, we do not know what the founders meant. We don't know what the Constitution was intended to do. All we have is the words on the page, plus the other writings of these guys, which is what we go to many times. That's what the Supreme Court goes to. Fortunately, you did have a group of genuine geniuses. There were geniuses among these people, James Madison being one of them. So the Constitution, very famously, quote, was made by geniuses so the country could be run by idiots. And we have had that a number of times in American history. They knew they were making history. They're very self-conscious. Jefferson and Madison write back and forth about the debates, and they write their letters in code so nobody could find out what they were really talking about. They had to compromise. All these people know each other. They fought in the revolution together, but they have different ideas, different personalities. And what happened is they balanced each other out. So the convention has 3 jobs. Prove that the Articles of Confederation don't work, which was pretty easy, pretty self-evident, and explain how a new government that they put together was going to solve these problems and keep the states happy so they wouldn't reject the new Constitution. You still have to keep local and state power as well. The Constitution is only an outline, and I don't want to get too much into Government 101 here because many of you have had it. But what the Constitution means is determined today by the Supreme Court. That's the job of the Supreme Court. And the Constitution is, in world government, America's contribution to political theory. It is still a great document. I would argue that it is not terribly democratic, that it is really more conservative and sometimes even Puritan. Certainly more so than the states were and even than most people expected. What they were worried about from the last 10 years before the convention was controlling democratic tendencies, not expanding them. Again, Puritans, if man is evil by nature, then man needs control. Many of the people who attended the convention were not gentlemen. And as John Adams said, many were not gentlemen, and, quote, never mind enlightened gentlemen. And those who were, remember that all men in society are not the founders, are not brilliant thinkers. So they look to the Dutch, they look to the Swiss, they look to the ancient Greeks. They have very few models. Ancient Greece fell because they squabbled among each other. Rome fell because it was taken over by dictators and ambitious men. This should be a lesson, both of those should be a lesson to us today. So, what do they have to do in the Constitution? Slide number 11 is some real problems they have to deal with. The first problem is the issue of large and small states, and this is the great compromise in the Constitution. 1790, we had our first census. There were 4 million Americans, including 700,000 slaves who are property, quote unquote. Virginia is the largest population, had over 800,000. You have little places like Rhode Island. Little places like Rhode Island are terrified that the large states are just going to swallow them up. So if we have a representative assembly, what kind of representation? Virginia wants a lot of power. Rhode Island, Connecticut do not want to be swallowed up. James Madison blended 2 different plans that were proposed and created a 2-house legislature. So in the Senate, we have 2 representatives from each state that are chosen for 6-year terms, longer terms. These senators were not elected by the people, not until 1915. So who chose them? State legislatures. They are more conservative. They are less likely to shift their opinions. They are a conservative bloc on the lower house, the House of Representatives, which is elected by population proportionately by direct election by the people. So right there in the House and Senate, originally they set up a system that curbed pure democracy. The House of Representatives is a democratic republic. We elect people to vote for us, and they are directly elected. But for 150 years, the Senate was not elected. Today it is, of course. So James Madison, genius of the Constitution, blends the 2, and we have representative by population and 2 from each state. So the large states are happy, the small states are happy. And any law that passes has to pass both houses of Congress. The other huge issue to deal with was slavery. And this is the Great Silence, as it was called. almost split the convention apart. We almost didn't have a constitution. We almost ended up with two countries. 60, 70 years later, we have a civil war for the same purpose. The problem was not solved in the Constitution. In fact, the word slave and slavery is never used in the Constitution. If you have never read the Constitution, it's all of 4 or 5 pages. It's, I think, at the end of the online textbook. You can find it online a lot of places. Sit down and read it sometime. It's not very long. Everybody should read the Constitution because everybody argues about it. So slavery, the word slave is not used. Instead, they talked about people, quote, held to service or labor. You have 5 slave states out of the 13. And in those slave states, a very large proportion of the population is slave. It varied from 30%. Virginia was 40%. South Carolina, the only majority, was 60% black. And in South Carolina and Georgia, I'm quoting from their representatives, such is the state of agriculture that no white man would perform the tasks required to drain the swamps and clear the land. So without slaves, it must be depopulated. Again, about slavery from one of the delegates, slavery is, quote, one of those habits established long before the Constitution and could not now be remedied, unquote. So furious debate. This is why the doors were locked. Nobody wants to go publicly with their views on slavery. They either had to compromise or cut the country in half and end up with 2 countries. The slave owners were not giving up their slaves. Northerners were not willing to allow slave owners to continue. And the issue becomes representation. How are slaves represented? In the end, 15 of the 55 delegates left the Constitution. It was not signed by 55. It was signed by 40. The 15 who left were Northerners who refused to deal with slavery, who refused to compromise. So we almost didn't have a country. We almost didn't have a constitution. The Quakers, with Ben Franklin, petitioned just end slavery right here and end the slave trade. Southerners refuse. Number one, how do you compensate Southern slave owners for 700,000 slaves? Slaves are property. You could free them, but how do you pay the slave owners? This is a government that has almost no funds to start out with. Second problem, of course, is what do you do with freed slaves? 700,000 people. What do you do with them? Nobody had an answer to that. The compromise they come up with after furious struggle is the 3/5, very famously 3/5 compromise, which made men slaves which made slaves men and property both. So for every 5 slaves, the state that they lived in would get 3 votes, 3/5 compromise. The slave trade was also going to be ended in 1808, not immediately, interestingly enough. And the 3/5 compromise was not for the Senate, because there's 2 for every state, but for the House of Representatives. Slave owners insist we are counting slaves for representation because, of course, this gave them more representatives in the House of Representatives. Northerners are furious because if slaves are property, they should not be counted as voters. Slaves don't vote. It was illegal to have slaves vote. So why are we counting them in the House of Representatives? Again, John Adams, are slaves men? Then make them citizens and let them vote. Are they property? Why then is no other property included? And John Adams stood up and said, if slaves are property, they should not be counted, or else my cow and my horse should also be counted for representation. Good point. The compromise was a 3/5 compromise, which of course gave Southern whites who are voting for their slaves much more representation. Southern states were on average in the House of Representatives, Southern states were 41% of the representatives, but they have 47% because they are counting slaves as for representation. Okay, so Southern states have a lot more power than they would otherwise in Congress. This is the devil's bargain that they made. Other minor issues with this: revenue for the national government, the new national government, tariffs, taxes on imports. A tariff is a tax on imports, regulation of federal trade, taxes on alcohol. You got to raise money somehow. The other issue they have to deal with is fear of an army. President civilian was put in charge. He is commander-in-chief in the Constitution. Militias were not a very efficient solution. They're too small, they're too late in case we were attacked by somebody. They are untrained as well, as we found out in the Revolution. The solution was you need an army and a militia. So a very small standing army, basically for Indian warfare and for in case of slave rebellions. And then citizen militias called up as needed, which today, of course, is the National Guard. George Washington argued against an army. He wants a small army, but we have to have one. He's a general who doesn't want an army. It's pretty rare in history. So we have the compromises. I would argue that they are not necessarily democratic. If you look at slides 12, 13, 14, balance of powers in there, I'm not going to get into this because this is Government 101, but the president does not have unlimited power. Congress passes all the laws. He can veto the laws, but then Congress can pass it over as veto. We have restrictions on Congress. They have to be elected pretty regularly, every 2 years for the House of Representatives. President can override their veto. The other branch of government, actually there are 4 branches of government: executive, legislative, judicial, and a free press, which is often called the 4th branch of government. But the judicial branch is in debate right now with the death of Ruth Bader Ginsburg. What do we do about appointing judges? And the Constitution said the president nominates, but the Senate confirms. So again, you have a balance of powers there. And the federal judges are appointed for life. Why are they appointed for life? They don't have to go back and be elected, and their decisions can be regardless of whatever the politics of the time happen to be. That's the theory anyway. We've had issues with this before as well. So balance of powers, clearly, there are a lot of restrictions on democracy in the Constitution. And the number one issue, of course, which is again in the news, is the Electoral College. We do not elect a president. You and I vote, but the vote goes to the Electoral College, and those electors pick the president. How many electors are there? The total of the Senate and the House of Representatives by population in the states. So every state has 2 plus the number of representatives. So for example, Wyoming, that doesn't have many people, has 3 electors in the House of Representatives. California, huge population, has something like 100 and something or other. Okay, so we have 535 electors. Their vote, their majority vote, elects the president. This is very Puritan. We don't trust the people to vote. So I would argue the Constitution is a very conservative, sometimes a puritanical document. We overlook that. We think it is a great democratic, but not really. Okay, so we get a compromise in there. We have a balance of powers. Money always goes through the legislature, and then it has to be ratified. It had to be ratified by 9 of the 13 states to become in action, to activate the Constitution, to be accepted. How was it ratified? By state delegates in state constitutions. Virginia and New York had some real criticisms of this. Again, James Madison and Federalists do not necessarily trust everybody, you and me, to rule ourselves. But we have to set up a democracy in which we don't trust everybody. So how are you going to get this thing passed. If you have an executive, the danger, of course, everybody's worried about is a king. They solved that problem. George Washington finally agrees to be president. And we know one thing about George Washington: he can be trusted with power. If he didn't accept that, who knows? Virginia might not have ratified it. George Washington was a Virginian, and then we wouldn't have had a constitution. Many states complain, where are our rights as citizens? So James Madison had to go back and write single-handedly the first 10 amendments, the Bill of Rights to the Constitution. He assumed that everybody knew what these were. No. People said, we want to see them in writing, because in Britain they are not in writing and they can be changed over time. These protect your civil rights, right to a jury trial, freedom of speech, freedom of religion, freedom to assemble, etc., etc. If you're not going to read the Constitution, at least read the Bill of Rights, the first 10 amendments to the Constitution. The last one says all powers not delegated to the federal government are reserved to the states. He had to put this in so people would support it. Okay, now we're ready to support that. George Washington's going to be president. A lot of people were still skeptical about a strong national federal government. So we had several guys who had to sit down and write the Federalist Papers, which nobody in America reads and everybody across the world reads them. They are arguments to adopt a strong central government when we just had a war to get rid of a strong central government. They are brilliant. They are long, a 10 to 20 page political theory, basically. There are 85 of them. They had to be written quickly. 77 were written in 6 months right before the Constitution is adopted, and they convinced many people, yeah, okay, the Constitution's going to work. Average about 4 a week were published widely in all the newspapers in America. Again, remember, high literacy rate, so people can be convinced of things. About 1 every 3 days. These are roughly, if I sat down and said, write 1,000 words a day on political theory and publish it immediately. In fact, they didn't even get to proofread some of them. We'd be lost. Fortunately, we had brilliant minds at the time. John Jay wrote 5 of them, but he became ill and he withdrew from the whole project. James Madison wrote 29. Again, he's the father of the Constitution. He has a vested interest in this, and he is a brilliant political thinker. Most of them were written by Alexander Hamilton, a very young New York lawyer who is writing these while working full-time at his legal practice with 6 kids at home. He wrote 21 of these straight in less than 2 months. Twice he wrote 5 in a week, and once he wrote 6 in a single week. So he's literally writing every day or two a political document of 10 to 20 pages. Again, sometimes James Madison couldn't even read them. They weren't even corrected for mechanical errors. They went immediately to the press. The main argument in the Federalist Papers was that republics, democracies, can work well over large areas because the different interest groups will cancel each other out. And you will end up with the interests of all being protected. They are brilliant. They are read across the world, and they help convince a lot of people that the Constitution was worth supporting. So finally, they get an almost unanimous, if I remember correctly, I think those rebels in Rhode Island did not endorse the Constitution, but 12 of the 13 new states endorsed the Constitution. And we have a form of government that has lasted for, 200 and something years, and is now the longest single form of government on the planet in history, and hopefully will last many, many more years. It is a brilliant document. I highly recommend you read it. If you don't have time for that, at least read the Bill of Rights. Those are your civil rights. Those are your rights as a citizen underneath the government. Take care.